In every war, there are secrets that never make it into the official histories, truths considered too volatile, too damning, or too destabilizing to expose. World War II, often remembered in terms of victory parades and liberation banners, hides a darker underbelly locked away in sealed files and forbidden archives. These are not the tales of battlefield heroics, but the disturbing realities that governments work tirelessly to suppress, fearing public outrage, political scandal, or global consequences that could alter the fragile order of the post-war world. Behind redacted pages and classified stamps, entire chapters of history were buried. Stories of clandestine experiments, covert deals with war criminals, secret massacres, and hidden atrocities that challenge the narrative of good versus evil. Tonight, we pry open those rusted vaults. We resurface the long-forgotten intelligence cables, the erased testimonies, and the declassified reports that paint a grim portrait of a war far more disturbing than we were ever meant to know. These are the 5 secrets of World War II that governments tried to keep buried forever. Listen closely, and when you hear what was hidden, decide for yourself. Should these truths have remained sealed, or does the world deserve to confront them, no matter how disturbing they may be? Your thoughts, your reactions, and your voice belong in this conversation. What would you have chosen, silence or exposure? The classified human experiments of Unit 731. Buried deep in the occupied territories of Manchuria, behind barbed wire and armed guards, the Japanese Imperial Army constructed one of the most horrifying facilities in human history. Unit 731, officially labeled as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. It carried an innocent title designed to mask an operation that would make Auschwitz doctors appear tame in comparison. The compound, located in Pingfang near Harbin, spanned over 6 square kilometers and operated under strict secrecy from 1936 until Japan's surrender in 1945. Within its walls, thousands of men, women, and children, mostly Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, and Korean captives, were subjected to experiments so cruel that many Japanese soldiers later admitted they could not sleep after witnessing them. What unfolded inside Unit 731 was not mere medical research, but the systematic weaponization of suffering, designed to produce blueprints for large-scale biological warfare. The experiments ranged from calculated exposure to diseases to procedures of surgical mutilation carried out without anesthesia. Prisoners, referred to coldly as maruta, the Japanese word for logs, were infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhoid. In some cases, entire families were locked inside sealed chambers, where plague-infested fleas were released to test the efficiency of disease transmission. Vivisections were routine, with researchers cutting open victims while they were still alive, monitoring the progression of pathogens within their organs. Frostbite experiments were conducted during the brutal Manchurian winters. Captives had their arms dipped in freezing water, then struck with sticks until the flesh sounded like breaking wood. These limbs were then thawed in various conditions, sometimes with fire, sometimes with hot water, sometimes by leaving them to rot, so scientists could study gangrene and tissue decay. It was science stripped of morality, fueled by an obsession with power and conquest. Unit 731's operations were not rogue experiments conducted by a few deranged doctors. They were meticulously planned, funded, and overseen by high-ranking officials of the Japanese Imperial Army. General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but fanatical physician, served as the mastermind. Ishii was granted near unlimited authority and resources, reporting directly to Emperor Hirohito's inner circle. Japanese military leaders believed biological weapons could become the decisive factor in defeating both China and eventually Western powers. They envisioned plague bombs dropped on enemy cities, cholera contaminating rivers, and typhoid crippling advancing armies. The grotesque suffering of Unit 731's victims was the test data for this vision of total war. By 1940, evidence shows that Unit 731 had already conducted live field tests. Japanese aircraft dropped plague-infested fleas over Chinese villages in Zhejiang and Hunan provinces, resulting in devastating outbreaks. Tens of thousands of civilians perished in these man-made epidemics. Local records and survivor testimonies describe sudden waves of dysentery, anthrax skin ulcers, and mass deaths from plague, outbreaks dismissed by Japanese authorities as natural occurrences. Yet, hidden reports within Japanese archives confirm that Unit 731 considered these field tests a success. proof that their biological weapons could wipe out populations with horrifying efficiency. In total, it is estimated that between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians died as a direct result of these experiments and attacks. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, one might assume the crimes of Unit 731 would have been laid bare at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Yet the truth was deliberately buried. General Shiro Ishii and his subordinates should have stood trial alongside men like Hideki Tojo. Instead, a secret deal was struck. American intelligence agencies, led by General Douglas MacArthur, recognized the immense military value of Unit 731's research. While the Nazis' crimes at Auschwitz and Dachau were prosecuted publicly, the atrocities of Unit 731 were erased from the official record. US Army documents, declassified decades later, reveal the shocking bargain: immunity for Ishii and his staff in exchange for exclusive access to their biological warfare data. The deal was sealed in 1947, when top-secret memoranda described the information as unique data of great national security importance, unobtainable through ordinary research. Thus, the men who had boiled prisoners alive and dissected them without anesthesia walked free, rewarded for their crimes. The US was not alone in this silent pact. The Soviet Union, too, sought to exploit the knowledge gained at Unit 731. In 1949, a handful of captured Japanese doctors were put on trial in Khabarovsk, Siberia, where detailed confessions about biological experiments were recorded. Yet these revelations, inconvenient during the rising tensions of the Cold War, were dismissed in the West as Soviet propaganda. The world was told the testimony was fabricated, while in reality, the Americans already held parallel evidence confirming its authenticity. By downplaying Soviet claims, Washington ensured that its own secret cache of Unit 731 data remained uncontested and under wraps. For decades, the Japanese government denied Unit 731's existence. Survivors' testimonies were ignored, archives destroyed, and officials dismissed accusations as lies. Only in the late 1980s and 1990s, when former members of Unit 731 began speaking publicly and lawsuits were filed in Japanese courts, did fragments of truth surface. Yet even then, the Japanese courts refused to recognize the victims' right to compensation, citing legal technicalities. The government's stance remained that wartime reparations had already been settled in post-war treaties. To this day, no official apology has been issued to the victims or their families. The silence is not accidental. It is the product of decades of deliberate suppression, designed to protect both Japan's post-war image and the intelligence advantages gained by the United States. Declassified American documents add a disturbing layer to the story. Reports show that the US military, in collaboration with scientists who had once served under Ishii, conducted biological warfare research at Fort Detrick, Maryland, using the stolen data. While American scientists never openly admitted replicating the live human experimentation, the influence of Unit 731's findings on US germ warfare strategy during the Korean War remains a contested but chilling possibility. Chinese and North Korean accusations that the US deployed biological weapons during the early 1950s, though dismissed by Washington, cannot be fully separated from the hidden legacy of Unit 731. The story of Unit 731 is not just one of wartime atrocity. It is a story of betrayal, of victims betrayed by their captors, of justice betrayed by politics, and of truth betrayed by the governments that chose silence over accountability. Behind the curtain of classified files lies a sobering question. How many lives were sacrificed to preserve the illusion of moral superiority? While secret laboratories in America and the Soviet Union quietly benefited from atrocities committed in Manchuria, in the shadows of history, Unit 731 stands as a grim monument to what happens when science is stripped of humanity and nations decide that truth is too dangerous to reveal. Today, the name Unit 731 is still whispered with horror, a reminder that some secrets of World War II remain more disturbing than the world was ever meant to know. Forbidden Nazi gold and Vatican silence. As the Third Reich crumbled in the spring of 1945, Allied intelligence units discovered something that remains shrouded in mystery even today: vast caches of looted Nazi gold, currency and precious artifacts that seemed to vanish into thin air. The Reichsbank, once brimming with the spoils of conquest, stood nearly empty. What happened between the last chaotic weeks of the war and the first Allied inspections remains one of the most disturbing financial mysteries of the 20th century. Buried beneath official denials and classified archives lies the story of secret convoys, shadowy banking deals, and the silent complicity of institutions that should have acted as guardians of morality. At the heart of this mystery is Operation Bernhard, a counterfeiting and looting program orchestrated by the SS that turned Europe's stolen wealth into a hidden war chest capable of sustaining fugitives, bribing officials, and reshaping the post-war balance of power. Witness accounts describe late-night convoys of SS trucks winding through the Austrian Alps, loaded with crates stamped with the Reichsadler, the Nazi eagle. Some of these transports were intercepted, such as the notorious Lake Toplitz cache in Austria, where crates of forged British banknotes were discovered submerged beneath icy waters. Yet countless other shipments simply disappeared. In May 1945, US troops uncovered a portion of the hoard in the Merkers salt mine in Germany. Hundreds of tons of gold bullion, stolen jewelry, foreign currencies, and priceless art. The discovery stunned Washington, but it also raised urgent questions. If this was only what was left behind, where had the rest gone? Reports filtered in of trains that had crossed into Switzerland, convoys routed toward monasteries in northern Italy, and crates unloaded at secluded airfields under SS command. The trail quickly grew cold, and in many cases deliberately so. The Vatican soon entered the shadows of this story. According to declassified US intelligence documents from the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, elements within the Catholic Church became involved in what later became known as the rat lines, clandestine escape routes that smuggled former SS officers, Gestapo agents, and Nazi collaborators out of Europe, often towards South America. These routes required money, documents, and safe havens. Investigators found repeated references to gold and valuables being funneled into Vatican-controlled banking channels. The Vatican Bank, shielded by sovereign immunity and secrecy, became an ideal node in this financial web. American intelligence officers noted with unease that several senior clerics, including Bishop Alois Hudal in Rome, facilitated not only the escape of Nazis, but also the laundering of their wealth. To accuse the Vatican openly, however, risked igniting a political and spiritual firestorm at the dawn of the Cold War. And so, silence prevailed. Switzerland, too, played a critical role. Swiss banks accepted Nazi deposits throughout the war, often in the form of melted-down gold stripped from central banks in occupied nations or taken from Jewish victims. Bars stamped with Reichsbank marks were recast, their origins erased, and quietly absorbed into neutral accounts. Allied diplomats attempted to press Switzerland for disclosure after 1945, but negotiations quickly devolved into political stalemate. In 1946, under the Washington Agreement, Switzerland paid only a fraction of the estimated billions it had received in Nazi assets. The rest remained buried within layers of banking secrecy. Documents reveal that both the United States and Britain chose not to push harder, preferring to preserve Switzerland as a neutral partner against Soviet expansion, rather than expose the full scope of its wartime complicity. The silence was not without consequence. These hidden funds allowed thousands of Nazis to vanish from post-war Europe. Figures like Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele escaped capture for decades, financed in part by resources smuggled through these clandestine channels. In Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, entire communities of Nazi fugitives emerged, sustained by money that had once been stolen from murdered families across Europe. Intelligence reports from the early 1950s describe Nazi operatives establishing businesses, investing in real estate, and even influencing local politics, their financial base secured by the missing gold. To trace these resources back to the Vatican or Swiss banks would have exposed a web of complicity that neither Allied governments nor the Church wished to confront. Church records, where they exist, remain sealed. Testimonies from former SS officers suggest that gold shipments were hidden in monasteries across Italy and Austria before being quietly transferred to sympathetic clerics. In 1997, a class-action lawsuit brought by Holocaust survivors' families accused the Vatican Bank of receiving and concealing Nazi gold stolen from Croatia, where the fascist Ustaše regime massacred Serbs, Jews, and Roma. Though the case was dismissed on grounds of jurisdiction, it forced into public view a question long suppressed. What role did religious and financial institutions play in laundering the blood-stained wealth of the Third Reich? Internal Vatican documents, if they exist, remain classified and inaccessible. The mystery extends beyond moral outrage. By burying the truth, Allied governments secured assets for their own covert purposes. Declassified MI6 memoranda reference special funds, appropriated from captured Nazi caches, later used to finance intelligence operations in occupied Germany and Eastern Europe. Some historians argue that this gold, untraceable and off the books, became seed money for anti-Soviet espionage networks such as Operation Gladio in Italy. In Washington, officials quietly categorized these financial questions as matters of national security, ensuring that the public never saw the full picture. The narrative of Allied righteousness required silence about uncomfortable bargains struck in the shadows. The true scale of the missing gold remains staggering. Estimates place the total value of Nazi-looted assets at more than $6 billion in 1945 currency, tens of billions in today's terms. While some was recovered, large portions were never accounted for. Even decades later, investigators stumbled upon fragments of the hidden treasure. In 1998, newly declassified US files revealed that American intelligence had tracked portions of Nazi gold to Argentine banks well into the 1950s. In 2000, a joint inquiry by the US State Department and international organizations acknowledged that both Switzerland and the Vatican had sheltered Nazi wealth, though the full extent remained obscured by destroyed files and closed archives. The moral weight of these discoveries is difficult to overstate. Behind every bar of gold lay stolen wedding rings, family heirlooms, and wealth ripped from Jewish communities annihilated in the Holocaust. To imagine those riches repurposed to smuggle the very perpetrators to safety is a wound that still festers in historical memory. Survivors testified of rings being stripped from corpses at Auschwitz, their gold fillings pulled by SS doctors before cremation. That same gold, melted and laundered, eventually reappeared in Swiss vaults or Vatican accounts, hidden in plain sight, while the victims were left voiceless. What makes this story more chilling is not only the theft, but the silence that followed. Governments that promised never again chose secrecy over justice. Religious leaders who preached morality shielded killers with blessings and passports. Banks that claimed neutrality profited from genocide. Each institution buried its role, preserving reputations while erasing accountability. The result is a narrative of World War II that remains disturbingly incomplete, its financial crimes relegated to footnotes when they should stand as central indictments of systemic betrayal. The Nazi gold remains a symbol not just of stolen wealth, but of suppressed truth. It is a reminder that history is not only written by victors, but also censored by them. In the quiet corridors of the Vatican, in the fortified vaults of Zurich, and in the sealed files of Allied intelligence, lie the remnants of a story governments tried to keep buried forever. The disturbing silence surrounding the Nazi treasure is not merely about missing gold. It is about the moral corruption that allowed entire nations and institutions to look away, leaving justice unfinished and truth concealed beneath the weight of secrecy. Hidden Soviet POW death camps. When the Third Reich finally collapsed in May 1945, millions of German soldiers laid down their arms, expecting captivity under the terms of international law. They knew of the Geneva Convention, which required humane treatment of prisoners of war, and many hoped that surrendering to the Western Allies or the Red Army would at least preserve their lives. But in the Soviet Union, the reality was far different. For millions of captured Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS soldiers, captivity was not a reprieve, but a death sentence by another name. Hidden from Western scrutiny, erased from official records, and denied access to the International Red Cross, these men were sent to a sprawling system of camps controlled by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. What unfolded inside these camps was not widely acknowledged until decades later. Systematic starvation, forced labor in lethal conditions, and a deliberate policy of attrition that claimed the lives of over 1 million prisoners. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union held roughly 3.3 million German prisoners of war. Stalin saw these men not only as enemies, but also as instruments of both punishment and utility. Official Soviet propaganda described them as fascist beasts, unworthy of compassion, while secret directives framed them as valuable labor resources for the reconstruction of a war-torn nation. Soviet industry lay in ruins after years of invasion and scorched earth policies. Mines, railways, and factories needed rebuilding, and the Red Army had neither the manpower nor the resources to achieve this quickly. The solution was forced labor, Entire trainloads of German captives were transported to camps scattered across Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Arctic Circle, where they were put to work in quarries, mines, and forests. Many were marched for days without food, beaten by guards if they faltered, and left to collapse along the roadside. For the survivors, the journey was only the beginning. The conditions in these camps were catastrophic. Prisoners received meager rations, often little more than 600 to 800 calories a day, barely enough to survive even without physical exertion. With labor demands that included mining uranium, hauling timber, or constructing railroads through permafrost, starvation and exhaustion became inescapable realities. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, typhus, and tuberculosis claimed thousands. Survivors later described winters where men froze to death overnight, their corpses stacked like firewood outside the barracks until spring. Some camps, like Vorkuta in the Komi Republic, became infamous for their brutality. Prisoners were forced to work in temperatures plunging below -40 degrees Celsius, clad only in threadbare uniforms, with frostbite amputations performed without anesthetic. Many never left the mines alive, their names deliberately erased from Soviet records. Unlike the Nazi camps, the Soviet system did not always pursue immediate extermination. Instead, it operated under a policy of slow attrition, starving prisoners, breaking their bodies, and working them to death. This was reflected in the mortality rates. Of the 3.3 million Germans captured, more than 1.1 million perished in Soviet custody. Those who survived captivity often returned years after the war, gaunt, broken, and carrying psychological scars that haunted them for life. The Soviet authorities, determined to maintain an image of moral superiority, refused to acknowledge these deaths. Records were falsified, with entire groups of men marked as released or missing in action rather than deceased. For families back in Germany, letters never arrived, and loved ones vanished into the abyss of silence. The International Committee of the Red Cross repeatedly requested access to Soviet POW camps, but Stalin denied it, labeling the inquiries as Western interference. To admit the scale of deaths would have undermined the Soviet Union's position as a righteous victor at the Nuremberg trials. Indeed, Soviet prosecutors at Nuremberg presented evidence of Nazi atrocities, while carefully avoiding any mention of their own treatment of prisoners. The hypocrisy was staggering. While the Allies condemned the inhumanity of Auschwitz and Dachau, millions were simultaneously dying in Soviet camps, an open secret among intelligence agencies, but a topic deemed too dangerous for public acknowledgement. Declassified documents from the Russian archives, released only after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, shed light on the full scope of the tragedy. One 1945 NKVD directive ordered that German prisoners be used for maximum productive labor, and that food rations be adjusted based on output. Those who could not work were deprioritized for supplies, a euphemism for slow starvation. In another report, Soviet officials admitted that death rates in certain camps exceeded 30% per year. Particularly harrowing were the uranium mines of the Gulag network, where exposure to radiation killed thousands silently and efficiently, leaving little evidence beyond the bodies buried in shallow pits. The cover-up extended beyond official Soviet channels. Western governments, aware of the disappearances, often chose silence for political reasons. During the early Cold War, West German leaders prioritized the release of surviving POWs, negotiating quietly with Moscow, rather than risking open accusations that could derail fragile diplomacy. In 1955, a decade after the war, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer secured the repatriation of the last major group of surviving prisoners, many of whom returned skeletal and near death. For countless families, this reunion came too late. Their fathers, brothers, or sons had long since perished, their graves unmarked, their deaths unacknowledged. Official records understated the losses, ensuring that the scale of the catastrophe never fully entered public memory. The Soviet Union presented its actions as justified retaliation for Nazi brutality on Soviet soil. Indeed, the German invasion of 1941 had unleashed unprecedented horrors, mass executions, starvation sieges, and atrocities committed by the Wehrmacht and SS. Millions of Soviet civilians and soldiers perished during the occupation. In this light, Stalin's policy of vengeance against German POWs carried a twisted logic. Yet vengeance disguised as justice does not erase the reality. the deliberate decision to allow mass death through neglect and exploitation, collective punishment of millions of soldiers, many of whom had no say in the crimes of the regime they served, was itself a war crime, hidden under layers of propaganda and falsified statistics. For decades, survivors of Soviet captivity struggled to tell their stories. In both East and West Germany, political pressures muted their voices. In the East, dominated by Soviet influence, speaking openly about Soviet abuses risked arrest. In the West, governments feared that too much emphasis on German suffering would appear to relativize Nazi crimes. As a result, the silence endured. Only after 1991 did historians gain access to KGB and NKVD files that confirmed the scale of the tragedy. Even then, many documents remained classified or destroyed, ensuring that the full truth may never be known. The families of the dead still lack closure, their relatives' final resting places lost in the vastness of Siberia and the frozen tundra. The story of the Soviet POW death camps is not an attempt to equate atrocities, but to reveal a suppressed dimension of World War II. History is not only about victors and villains, but about the choices made to conceal uncomfortable truths. The Allies built a narrative of liberation and justice, but that narrative required silence about the crimes of their Eastern partner. In doing so, they allowed millions of vanished soldiers to remain voiceless, their suffering hidden behind iron curtains of secrecy. These forgotten dead remind us that the truth of World War II is not as clear-cut as official histories suggest. In the shadows of archives and the frozen earth of Siberia lies a chapter of the war governments tried to bury forever, a chapter that demands remembrance even if it shatters the myth of moral absolutes. Suppressed Allied atrocities in Dresden. In the closing months of World War II, as the Nazi regime teetered on the edge of total collapse, an act of destruction unfolded that has remained one of the most controversial episodes of the Allied war effort. On the nights of February 13th and 14, 1945, the ancient city of Dresden was reduced to ash in a storm of fire so intense that it created hurricane-like winds, sucking oxygen from the streets and suffocating those who had fled to cellars and bomb shelters. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces unleashed nearly 4,000 tons of high-explosive bombs and incendiaries on a city that was, by all accounts, overflowing with civilians, refugees and wounded soldiers. Dresden, once celebrated as the Florence on the Elbe for its Baroque architecture and cultural treasures, became a furnace of death. Official records reported over 25,000 civilian deaths, though survivor accounts and some post-war estimates placed the number far higher, possibly exceeding 35,000. This was not merely collateral damage. Classified documents and hidden communiques suggest that the firebombing of Dresden was conceived not as a tactical strike, but as a calculated display of terror, an act intended to send a message to both Germany and the Soviet Union. Dresden held little strategic importance compared to other German cities. It was not an industrial hub on the scale of Essen or Hamburg, nor a military command center like Berlin. By early 1945, the city had become a sanctuary for civilians fleeing the advancing Red Army, swelling its population far beyond normal levels. The city's rail yards were functional, but the bulk of its economy revolved around cultural institutions, historic architecture, and light industry. Classified British Air Ministry memoranda later revealed that planners selected Dresden not for military necessity, but for its symbolic value. Destroying a city renowned for beauty and culture was meant to crush German morale and demonstrate the overwhelming power of Allied air superiority. The RAF's Bomber Command, under Air Chief Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, had long pursued a doctrine of area bombing, obliteration of entire urban zones to demoralize enemy populations. Dresden became the ultimate embodiment of this doctrine. The operation unfolded in meticulously orchestrated waves. On the night of February 13th, nearly 800 RAF bombers struck first, dropping a combination of high explosives to shatter buildings and incendiaries to ignite the debris. Hours later, as survivors clawed their way out of the rubble and fire brigades struggled to respond, a second wave of over 500 bombers descended, trapping thousands in a city already aflame. The next day, American B-17 bombers of the US 8th Air Force launched daylight raids, compounding the devastation. Eyewitnesses recalled firestorms so intense that asphalt streets melted and winds tore children from their parents' arms. Those who fled to the Elbe River suffocated as the flames consumed oxygen, while others were incinerated in underground shelters as the firestorms drew superheated air into the basements. Entire neighborhoods vanished, leaving only smoldering ruins and charred corpses. In the aftermath, mass cremations were ordered to prevent outbreaks of disease, further erasing the identities of countless victims. What made Dresden especially disturbing was not only the scale of civilian casualties, but the secrecy that followed. Winston Churchill himself, in a memorandum dated March 28, 1945, expressed unease about the attack. "The destruction of Dresden," he wrote, "remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing." Churchill's words were later edited and softened in official archives, but the original memo revealed a rare glimpse of doubt at the highest level. The operation's defenders argued that Dresden was a legitimate transportation hub, critical to the movement of German troops to the Eastern Front. Yet internal discussions, unearthed in declassified documents decades later, painted a darker picture. The attack was partly intended as a demonstration of force, directed not at Germany, but at Joseph Stalin. As the Yalta Conference concluded just days before the bombing, Allied leaders sought to remind the Soviet Union of Western firepower and willingness to deploy it with devastating effect. Dresden, a city of civilians, became the message. The cover-up began almost immediately. Official casualty counts were deliberately downplayed to avoid comparisons with Nazi atrocities. Photographs of the incinerated dead, stacked in piles or burned beyond recognition, were classified and restricted. Journalists, who attempted to question the scale of the attack, were silenced or accused of undermining the Allied war effort. When German sources claimed death tolls of over 200,000, Allied governments dismissed them as propaganda, even though their own internal estimates often admitted uncertainty. The chaos of the firestorm had obliterated entire blocks of the city, making accurate counts nearly impossible. Still, the number released to the public, 25,000, was carefully chosen to appear tragic, yet defensible. Any acknowledgement of higher figures risked accusations of war crimes, undermining the carefully constructed narrative of Allied moral superiority at the Nuremberg trials. For survivors, the horror of Dresden lingered long after the war ended. They carried memories of loved ones vaporized in fire, of streets lined with ash and bone fragments, of the unbearable stench of burning flesh that haunted the city for weeks. Yet their testimonies were often met with skepticism or silence, overshadowed by the larger narrative of Nazi crimes. To speak too loudly about Dresden risked accusations of sympathy for the Reich. In East Germany, the Soviet-backed government exploited the tragedy for propaganda, portraying Dresden as evidence of Western barbarity while ignoring Soviet atrocities. In the West, discussion of the firebombing remained muted, relegated to whispers rather than headlines. The dead of Dresden were caught in a political tug-of-war, their suffering weaponized or suppressed, depending on who controlled the narrative. Historians, who later gained access to British and American archives, uncovered evidence that the Dresden raid was part of a broader strategy of psychological warfare. Allied planners debated targeting cultural centers specifically to break German morale, knowing that destroying places of beauty and heritage would inflict emotional wounds beyond the physical. Dresden's Baroque churches, opera houses, and palaces became collateral in a campaign that viewed civilian suffering as a tool of victory. Bomber Harris, who remained unapologetic until his death, argued that the attack shortened the war by weeks, perhaps months, yet the strategic impact remains disputed. German forces on the Eastern Front were not decisively slowed, and the war ended less than 3 months later, largely due to Soviet advances and the collapse of Nazi leadership. The military value of Dresden's destruction remains questionable, its symbolic devastation undeniable. The memory of Dresden continues to stir debate even today. For some, it represents the harsh reality that total war spares no one, that the lines between civilian and combatant blur when nations fight for survival. For others, it remains a crime without justice, a massacre cloaked in the language of strategy, hidden behind redacted memos and sanitized reports. What is undeniable is that the Allied governments worked tirelessly to suppress the full truth, fearing the political consequences of admitting their own atrocities. The bombing of Dresden stands as a reminder that history is not simply a record of what happened, but also of what was erased, altered, or silenced to protect reputations. In the firestorm of February 1945, a city was consumed not only by flames, but by secrecy, and the ashes still whisper of the truths governments tried to keep buried forever. Erased files of Operation Paperclip. When the guns of World War II fell silent in 1945, one might have expected the pursuit of justice to dominate the post-war world. Nuremberg had set the precedent. War criminals would face trial. The guilty would be punished, and humanity would stand united against atrocity. Yet in the shadows of collapsing Germany, another story was unfolding, one of secret recruitment, rewritten identities, and erased crimes. Under the codename Operation Paperclip, the United States launched a clandestine program to extract and resettle more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers and medical doctors, many of whom had served the Nazi regime at the highest levels. Far from facing justice, these men were granted immunity, new lives, and in many cases, celebrated careers. Their crimes, slave labor, human experimentation, and complicity in mass murder were deliberately hidden, their files sanitized or destroyed. What emerged was one of the most disturbing bargains of the 20th century, the decision to trade. Justice for technological supremacy in the coming Cold War. The program began even before the Reich's unconditional surrender. As American forces advanced into Germany, intelligence units were given secret directives: seize laboratories, capture key personnel, and secure documents before the Soviets could. The race was not only for men but for ideas, jet propulsion, rocketry, chemical weapons, and advanced aeronautics. The Germans had developed innovations that far outpaced Allied research. The V2 rocket, designed by Wernher von Braun and his team at Peenemünde, was the world's first long-range ballistic missile, capable of striking London and Antwerp with devastating force. Allied leaders saw in these weapons the seeds of a new era, an era in which whoever mastered such technologies would dominate not only battlefields, but the future of global warfare. Wernher von Braun quickly became the most prominent figure of Operation Paperclip. As technical director at Peenemünde, von Braun oversaw the development of the V2 rocket program. The rockets themselves were built not in clean laboratories, but in the subterranean hell of Mittelwerk, a vast underground factory near Nordhausen. Tens of thousands of prisoners from the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp were forced into brutal labor, carving tunnels by hand and assembling missiles under constant threat of beatings, starvation, and execution. Estimates suggest that 20,000 prisoners died in Mittelwerk, more than the number killed by the V2 rockets themselves. Survivors testified to unimaginable cruelty, men collapsing from exhaustion and being hanged in front of their fellow workers as a warning, bodies left dangling from cranes. Von Braun later claimed ignorance, yet evidence in SS records shows he visited the site repeatedly, fully aware of the conditions under which his weapons were built. In the post-war world, these facts were inconvenient. To secure von Braun and his colleagues, American intelligence officials deliberately erased references to their Nazi Party membership and SS affiliations. Files were rewritten, with sanitized biographies describing them as apolitical or even opposed to the regime. This was no clerical oversight. It was policy. A declassified memorandum from the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which oversaw Paperclip, explicitly ordered that information regarding war crimes or membership in criminal organizations must be expunged to facilitate recruitment. In other words, the very crimes that should have condemned these men were deliberately buried to make them palatable as American assets. Von Braun himself, once an SS Sturmbannführer, was recast as a visionary scientist, his past sealed in classified archives. Von Braun was not alone. Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine, had been connected to experiments at Dachau in which prisoners were subjected to low-pressure chambers, freezing temperatures, and saltwater ingestion tests. These experiments left many dead or permanently disabled, yet Strughold was relocated to Texas, where he became a celebrated figure in NASA's early spaceflight program. Walter Schreiber, a general in the Wehrmacht's medical corps, was implicated in vaccine experiments conducted on unwilling human subjects, yet he too was brought to America. Dozens of others, chemists, biologists, engineers, were relocated, their Nazi ties scrubbed away. The erasure was so thorough that many of their names did not resurface until the 1980s, when investigative journalists began prying open the classified vaults of Paperclip. The strategic rationale was simple. The Cold War demanded supremacy at any cost. The Soviet Union, too, was seizing German scientists, relocating entire teams to Moscow and its secret cities. Stalin's intelligence agencies moved quickly, capturing rocket specialists, aviation engineers, and chemical weapons experts. In this context, American officials argued, Failure to recruit Nazi scientists would mean surrendering technological dominance to the Soviets. It was a race to harness the minds that had served Hitler, with little regard for the moral compromises involved. In Washington, national security eclipsed justice. Trials were for the losers of the war. The winners rewrote the rules. Operation Paperclip's success was undeniable from a technological perspective. Von Braun and his team eventually developed the Redstone rocket, the Jupiter missile, and ultimately the Saturn V, the rocket that carried American astronauts to the moon. Strughold's research shaped the field of space medicine, ensuring that astronauts could survive the rigors of space travel. German aeronautical engineers revolutionized jet design, and chemists advanced fields ranging from pesticides to pharmaceuticals. Behind every triumph of the American space program lay the concealed history of Paperclip. Knowledge acquired not in universities, but in concentration camps and slave labor factories. The public image carefully crafted for these men contrasted sharply with their hidden pasts. Von Braun appeared on Disney television specials in the 1950s, smiling as he explained the possibilities of space exploration. He became an icon of progress, his Nazi past relegated to whispers and footnotes. American schoolchildren were taught to revere him as the genius behind the moon landing, never told of the thousands who had died building his rockets. This whitewashing was deliberate, protected by classified files and enforced by a culture of silence. To question von Braun's legacy was to question the very foundation of America's Cold War triumph. The cover-up extended into official channels. When survivors of Mittelbau-Dora attempted to file testimony against former engineers, their voices were dismissed. Evidence gathered at the Dora war crimes trials was quietly downplayed, and American officials blocked extradition requests. In the 1950s, when journalists began to uncover fragments of the story, the government responded with denials or vague statements about unverified claims. Only decades later, when declassification made the documents undeniable, did the truth emerge. Paperclip was not merely a recruitment program, but a systematic erasure of war crimes in the name of national security. The moral cost of Operation Paperclip cannot be measured in scientific advances alone. It represents a profound betrayal of justice. While some Nazis were hanged at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity, others were quietly granted visas, houses in suburban America, and positions in government laboratories. The contrast is stark. Men like Werner von Braun received medals and applause, while their victims lay in unmarked graves beneath tunnels carved by slave labor. The decision to conceal these crimes was not an accident, but a policy, a choice to bury the past in order to build the future. Even today, the legacy of Operation Paperclip casts a long shadow. NASA's achievements are rightly celebrated, but beneath them lies an uncomfortable truth. The rockets that carried humanity to the moon were born in tunnels of death, built by men whose crimes were erased to serve new masters. The story of Paperclip forces us to confront an unsettling question. How much atrocity are we willing to ignore if the knowledge gained promises progress? For the governments that orchestrated Paperclip, the answer was clear. Justice could be sacrificed, memory could be rewritten, and the truth could remain buried. Yet the echoes of those erased files remain, whispering from declassified archives and survivor testimonies, reminding us that even in victory, there are secrets governments fight to keep hidden forever. The secrets unearthed in these buried files remind us that history is never as clear as textbooks suggest. World War II, so often portrayed as a battle of good versus evil, left behind shadows too deep for easy narratives. The firebombed ruins of Dresden, the erased files of Operation Paperclip, the horrors of Unit 731, and the silenced voices of Soviet and Allied atrocities all reveal a truth governments worked desperately to conceal. These were not isolated incidents, but deliberate acts of suppression, carefully engineered to protect reputations, secure power, and shape the post-war order. Even now, much remains sealed behind redacted pages and locked archives, the details hidden from public scrutiny under the guise of national security. What other truths still lie buried in classified vaults, waiting to be exposed? As long as secrecy prevails, the ghosts of World War II will continue to whisper, demanding to be heard. The question is whether we are prepared to listen and to confront the uncomfortable truths that challenge the stories we have been told. Share your thoughts below and let the debate continue. Because the war may have ended in 1945, but its darkest secrets remain very much alive.